I'm Inge Woolf. I was born in Vienna in 1934, and it was a time of unrest already. There was unrest in the streets, and when my father went to visit my mother after I'd been born, he couldn't get her. There was no public transport, and so he had to walk through Vienna to the other side of town to visit to see me for the first time, and there was gunshots in the streets, so already there was unrest when I was born. I was born into a very warm and loving Jewish family. Not a very observant family, but we did keep the Jewish festivals, and my grandfather always used to like to invite special cousins for the Passover Seder, especially because they had good voices. Traditionally, in my mother's family, they didn't have very good voices, but they always celebrated the festivals with the traditional meals and the traditional songs. And they were business people. Both my grandfather, David, and his wife, Rosalie, had come from adjoining villages in the Czech Republic. And Vienna was the big city of the Austria-Hungary kingdom. And so they came to make a better life for themselves to Vienna. And he started out as a business of buying second-hand goods, and he was good with his hands, so he fixed them up and resold them. And later on, he established a business where first, when sewing machines came on the market, he sold sewing machines, and his sons, it was a family business, his sons went out into the countryside with the sewing machines, taught the women to sew using them, and then sold them the sewing machines. And later on, when the motorbikes came onto the scene, he sold motorbikes as well. And my mother was the youngest and was in the business then as well. And she also sold motorbikes. And here I am, when I was 3. The Nazis, Anschluss, came. And we lived around the corner from where the Hitler's parade was going to come into the city. And I remember standing at the windowsill of our apartment, watching our happy neighbours hanging out the swastikas. And the swastikas came in all sizes. They were red and black and gold. And I have vivid pictures of our happy neighbours hanging out the swastikas to welcome Hitler's troops into Vienna. And I was afraid. I must have picked up that fear from hearing the grown-ups talking. And the amazing thing is that fear has stayed with me. And every time I talk about it, as I'm talking now, my stomach goes into a knot. And, you know, I can feel it in my body, the fear that I felt as a child. And I find that absolutely amazing. I also remember another time when, evening, when I looked out of the window and there were brown-shirted Nazi troops running down the street. And I somehow knew they were out to get Jews. And it made me feel, again, very scared. So it was a very terrifying time for Jews in Vienna. My father told the story of how, you know, when he was walking home, he went past shops that had been targeted by Nazis, and the graffiti was written over their windows and on the pavements outside, and the Jewish shop owners were made to come out and scrub the pavements with a toothbrush to get rid of the graffiti. And he described how the women with their nicely manicured hands had to put their hands in the buckets with soda and lye in there, so their skin was red and raw. And so it was they they were looking for other Jews to help, but my father was blue-eyed and fair-haired, and so he was able to get away with it, not being recognised as a Jew. And it was when the president said goodbye to his people on the radio that my father realised that it was time for us to go. And the story is that my family, my mother's and her family and her brothers and us, we were sitting around listening to his speech on the radio, and my father turned off the radio and said, "No, it's time for us to go." And so they tried to persuade the old people to go as well, but older people were not so easy to move, and they thought Hitler wouldn't last very long, and so they stayed. But we were able to get out because my father had a Czech passport, and so we were able to get out on his passport, and my mother's brothers got out illegally. They went out over the borders, across the country, across the hills and mountains, and escaped that way. We went on a train to Prague, and there we stayed while my parents got together their papers. My aunt, who was left in Vienna, was of Polish origin and didn't have a passport to get out. And my father she was dark like my mother and looked a bit like my mother. So my father took a train back to Vienna and brought her out on my mother's passport. It took a year for my parents to get together the papers that they needed to get out of Czechoslovakia and to find a haven. Jewish people at that time in Europe were trying to get out. And it was very hard, just as it is now for refugees that are trying to get out of the Middle East. It was very hard for them to get out and find a haven, somewhere to go. And my parents, in the end, devised an idea of how they would get out, and they got a holiday visa and to go to England. So they got a holiday visa and a return ticket. And we went through a conversion process too. In a little village called Majava, near where my father was born, there was a Lutheran church that was doing conversions for Jews. And they knew that it wasn't a real conversion, but that was their effort to save Jews. And I can remember being in that church, dark church, scary, with my parents, and kneeling and being converted to Christianity. And then I wore a little gold cross, and I remember being on the train, all dressed up. People, when they travelled in those days, dressed in their best clothes. But it must have been very scary because my mother said it was the last day they could use their passports, because it was the day before the Germans marched into Czechoslovakia and occupied Czechoslovakia. And the train, I can remember that train ride, it was full of military. And I was scared. And my parents told me I had to be a very good little girl and lie down and go to sleep, because not to draw attention to ourselves. Because although we had papers that said we were Christians, it wouldn't have saved us if anyone really looked at them. And so the train went to Berlin. So if I was scared, my parents must have been terrified. It must have been like walking into the lion's den. But there we got a plane at a time when my mother said only film stars flew. And we went to England. And I can remember the plane ride too, because we were up above the clouds. And I thought that must be heaven. And I was looking for God and the angels. And so we arrived in England, and my father immediately applied for refugee status there. And I have a copy of the document where he applied and said that we were Jews and we were frightened for our lives. So we were taken in by the British, and there was a lovely family that took us in for our first few months in England, a lovely family called the Selling-Courts. And they had a little small holding in Ripley outside in Surrey, and my parents helped around the place. They were laying, I can remember my father laying a parquet, helping to lay a parquet flooring, and my mother helped with the cooking and the housework. But they treated us family, not as servants. And we learned a lot about English life there. And my mother talked about the roast dinners that they served on a Sunday roast, you know, and how they were rare, cooked rare. They cooked the meat rare, and she wasn't used to seeing blood on the plate. She thought that was really quite an eye-opener for her. But they were very kind to us, and they kept us there for a few months until my parents felt ready to be on their own feet, and we went back to London. My father was in the Czech army. He was in the Czech brigade of the British Army in Montgomery's army. And so he was away a lot of the time. But I lived with my mother in a small flat, just a room really, a room, and, with a gas ring in the corner and a bed in the other corner and a sewing machine, always a sewing machine, because she kept sewing to bring in money. And my father would come and visit on his days off. And once, when it was a really bad bombing, he found that we weren't going to the underground stations where the shelters were, the bomb shelters were. We were hiding in our bed. You know, I'd hide under the eiderdown because I'd be frightened that the Germans would come and shoot me. And my mother would distract me by making me recite my times tables. And so she was, you know, she might have been scared too, but she always tried. My parents always tried to make me as happy as they could. They hid the bad stuff from me. They didn't talk about the bad stuff if they could help. If they talked about it, they talked about it in German, which I could no longer understand. And so I'd say, please, Mummy and Daddy, please don't argue. You know, I thought they were arguing. And my father said, no, we're not arguing, we're just talking politics. But they always took care to make my life as good as it could be. And if anyone asked me, I would have said I had a happy childhood in spite of everything. And we never got any further than living in the very poor conditions. So then my father got sick and he died. And I was 21 by then. And my mother had two brothers who had come here to New Zealand. And they said, come, it's a good country. And we finally got the papers together and we came to New Zealand. And life was good to us here. And my mother took her samples of her duffel coats to farmers, and they gave her a big order. She didn't have the money to buy the material for the big order, so my uncle lent her the money for the first season, and then at the end of the season, when she got paid, she repaid the money straight away, because she wasn't going to be beholden to her brothers, independent. And they did that for 2 seasons, and then after that she was able to stand on her own 2 feet. So she prospered here and sold her children's wear up and down the country, eventually. So we escaped and we had a good life here in New Zealand. And I'm always grateful to New Zealand for that. My family, however, wasn't so lucky. When my father returned from the war, he was a broken man. He had seen terrible things. He had been on guard and one of his best friends had been shot beside him. And I don't know what other terrible, he didn't talk about it much. But I was a bit scared of him when he came back because he talked to himself and he'd sit by the fire remembering some of the things and talking to himself in Czech, which I didn't understand. And it took a long time for him to come back to being a whole person. It took at least a year or two. And he was always a man in Vienna. He loved the cultured life. And he brought us back to Judaism. And one day when I was 15, he said to me, he and my mother said to me, come on, tidy yourself up. We're going to synagogue. And by the way, you're Jewish. And that's how I came back to Judaism. And I came back to it very quickly. You know, he introduced me to a youth club, and soon I had Jewish friends. And I can remember by the time I was 17 and into one of those debates that you get into as when you're a teenager. And there was another girl there saying that we should forgive and forget the Holocaust. It's gone, we should move on. And I said very vehemently, I'm never going to forget. And I'm going to see that my children don't forget as well. And so I was about 17 by then, so I'd well and truly come back to my roots. We had been in England 18, 19 years, and we hadn't progressed. And we never felt we hadn't progressed in the way of being able to save any money or be in better conditions. We still lived in 2 rooms and a kitchen with no bathroom. We hadn't been, despite the fact that I was then earning as well, we hadn't been able to progress, and we'd never felt really truly accepted by the English. However, when we came to New Zealand, it was much easier to make progress. We were welcome to the country, and New Zealanders had a really welcoming attitude to us. And I always feel that even now, that New Zealand is a good country for immigrants. I wish they would take a few more, especially where people are coming from tough lives in war-torn countries. But I think their processes are good. I think they look after people really well when they first come. And the average New Zealander welcomes people of all ethnicities and treats them equally. There's not the there's not the class structure here that there is in England, for instance. And I do think that that's a very good thing. We were lucky we escaped, but the rest of my family were not so lucky. And I met my lovely husband, and we started a family together and a business, and I concentrated on that. My parents had never talked much about the Holocaust or really much about family. I had to really squeeze it out of my mother later on. Certainly my father never talked about it. And I got on with my life and had a good life here in New Zealand. And it wasn't until after I retired that I started to think about that time and what my family went through. And when someone suggested that we start up the Holocaust Centre, the time was right for me. I was looking for something that I could be as passionate about as I had been in building up my own business. And I realised that this was important work to do. And in a way it rounded out my life. So I feel very privileged that in my later years I've been able to tell my story. I've been able to work with some wonderful people who are all as devoted to the work of the Holocaust Centre as I am. And I feel it's a great privilege to be able to tell the story of the Holocaust so it should never be forgotten. Lots of good lessons to be learned from the terrible times with the Holocaust. How you have to be careful who you elect. Hitler was elected, so you have to think carefully before you put someone in power. So civics, human rights, how you must never just treat someone badly because of their religion or their race, that everyone is human and the same, no matter what your background is. It's a very important lesson to learn. And lessons of how we're all individuals and we all have our own faiths and our beliefs, but we should respect each other no matter how different people are to us. There's more lessons to be learnt. I think that even in the frailty of of us human beings, where even in a civilised country like Germany was in those times, it was a highly civilised, cultured country, and the Holocaust happened there. And if it can happen there, it can happen anywhere.